What is historical fiction? What kind of work does the genre do that other forms of fiction cannot? How can it be used to privilege and disadvantage different groups of people? And how can it be used to humanize and restore dignity? These are some of the questions that I have been sitting with since I read Zakes Mda's latest novel, The Zulus of New York, last year. There is a rich history and tradition of historical fiction by African writers that one can use to explore all of these questions. For example, according to Bekizizwe Peterson, Herbert Isaac Ernest Dlomo wrote The Black Bulls, his historical plays Shaka, Dingane, Ngcukaitobi, Mfolozo, and Moshweshwe, to explore the power that made up African experiences in the 19th century, while simultaneously allegorizing the continued struggles of Black South Africans in the early 20th century. This is related to one of the reasons why Chinua Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart, to show his African readers that their history was not one long night of darkness from which the first Europeans saved them. More recently, the likes of Novuyo Chume, Yagyasi, Namwali Sapel, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and Jennifer Nansumbuga Makumbi have also used historical fiction to explore questions of identity, collective memory, gender and sexuality, and our simultaneous experiences of the past and the present. Zakes Mda has been adding to this tradition of historical fiction throughout his career as a novelist. In The Sculptors of Mapungubwe, he wrote against the apartheid myth that Southern Africa was empty when the Boers left the Cape in 1836. He does this by setting his story in the culturally and economically wealthy state of Mapungubwe and tells the story of the rivalry between two brothers who serve as royal sculptors for the numerous religious ceremonies of the state. Mda also spent some time rememorizing one of his ancestors who lived in the 1700s in his later historical novel, Little Sons. Mamani was a woman who took the throne after her father died and became a king, not a queen. As the new king, she sent out emissaries to find her a suitable bride. Their marriage was one of the first homosexual marriages to be acknowledged in South Africa. Mda has said that he grew up on oral traditions that continued to help him and his family trace their family lineage back to when they first migrated from the Great Lakes. However, this genealogy only traces the male line, and women only come up if they did something that was seen as offensive. Mamani was a historical figure that his elders wanted to remove from their genealogy because, as they saw it, she was a transgressive woman. Luckily, Mda restored her place in this genealogy first in Little Sons and also in an opera he has said he is working on. Mda adds to this tradition of using historical fiction to humanize Black people of the past in his latest novel, The Zulus of New York. Scientific discourse is premised on the idea of collecting data in as unbiased a manner as possible through observations. Of course, no experimental setup is totally without bias, and it is the experimenter's responsibility to acknowledge this bias and make provisions for how to account for it in their final result. The data that is collected is then used to try and explain phenomena and to make reliable predictions about the world we live in. This is a process that is followed in both the so-called hard sciences like physics and chemistry and the so-called soft sciences like psychology and sociology. In historical fiction, fictional history, and historical reality, Hayden White makes the argument that history as a discipline will never become like other modern sciences. This is because historical discourse is premised on what can be established as true, based largely on what can physically be found in the historical archive, whether it is written records, the architecture of buildings, art, or audio and visual recordings. Of course, the idea of a physical historical archive has been mobilized by world-renowned leaders and scholars to spread falsifiable ideas like Africans have no history. Hayden White stresses that this way of thinking neglects the idea that the real world consists not only of what can be established as true, but it also consists of what is possible. The way that history is practiced as an academic discipline also fails to acknowledge that archives are not exclusively physical. memory, patterns of behavior, and even transgenerational trauma are also forms of archive. For example, in post-traumatic slave syndrome, America's legacy of enduring injury and healing, DeGruy shows us how the multi-generational trauma experienced by African Americans manifests itself into a set of beliefs, behaviors, and actions that were developed as survival strategies against structural oppression. These beliefs, behaviors, and actions are still practiced today, even though our current context may not require them. Many historians do not necessarily see it as part of their jobs to imagine the possibility of how the trauma experienced by people in the past could manifest itself in the lives of those people's descendants generations later. Most would be more interested in the ways of being that these people found in spite of their circumstances. And I guess that from an academic point of view, there is an argument to be made as to why this would be the case. Historical fiction does the job of fitting quite snugly into this space of imagined possibility that history refuses to occupy. As Mda puts it, history tells us what happened in the past, but historical fiction shows us what it was like to be in what happened. The Zulus of New York tells the story of Ngcukaitobi, a former high-ranking official of King Ngcukaitobi's army who had to flee Zululand for Cape Town after having a relationship with one of the king's isigodlo girls in 1878. Mpi ends up meeting the great Farini, an impresario who runs a profitable freak show masked as an anthropological lecture at London's Royal Westminster Aquarium. At this time, the Western world was infatuated with the Zulu nation after they defeated the modern British Army with their spears, shields, and military tactics at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. Farini was in the Cape looking for people he could pass off as Zulu in London. Impi and a few other Africans end up gaining popularity in Farini's show in London, and eventually they moved to New York. What the great Farini did was a common practice of the time. In The Land Is Ours, South Africa's first black lawyers and the birth of Constitutionalism, Ngcukaitobi briefly writes about Frank Ellis, who, in 1899, took over 200 natives of South African tribes, a number of Boer families, and a number of animals to the Empress Theatre in London for daily shows. The show was set up in order to shock the British public about the so-called savagery of the black races of Southern Africa. This was shown in the main production, a reconstruction of scenes drawn from the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. This fascination with the Zulu people has continued in our contemporary times. In his review of Mda's novel for the Sowetan newspaper, Sthembi Somsomi quotes the following lyrics from Frank Sinatra's Don't Bring Lulu. "She's the kind of smarty that breaks up every party. Hula baloo, don't bring Lulu. I'll bring her myself. We all went to the party, real high-toned affair. Then came along Lulu, wild as any Zulu." Msomi also mentions a line from Ben Affleck's 2012 film Argo, where one of the characters is heard saying,
"But Warren confided in me that the picture's gone over budget because the Zulu extras want to unionize. They may be cannibals, but they want health and dental so the movie's kaput."
These two examples show us that the stereotype of Zulu people as savages and barbarians endures to this day. In his novel, Mda gives his black characters complicated interiority and agency. For example, Impi is well aware of the damage that the misrepresentation of Zulus in London and New York can cause. As a result, the dances he initially choreographs are meant to show off the beauty of his people's culture and the tremendous skill one must develop to perform them. However, because he has to make a living in a foreign land where he is seen as less than human, he gives in to Farini's insistence that the dances should show Western audiences the so-called savagery of the Zulus. Farini tells him, "You cannot have beautiful dances. You are savages. Otherwise, you'll alienate the audience. Everything about you must be ugly." Mpi proves Farini wrong later on in the novel, when he puts together an act he calls the Friendly Zulus that achieves some success in New York City. While in America, Mpi comes across a Dinka woman named Akol, who spends her days on display in a cage in a New York City park. Mpi falls in love when he first sees Akol, and he in turn sparks a vague interest in her. For the first time since she's been on display, she shows an awareness of the world around her, something the people who pay to see her have not seen before. Everyone looks around to see what has caught her attention and made her smile, but they all look past Mpi. They do not see him, Mda writes. He is invisible. Later on in the book, when Nicole giggles at something Mpi does, the onlookers go crazy trying to find out what caused this reaction. The spectators have never seen this before. They have never heard a single sound uttered from her lips. They all sigh in unison and exclaim, "Ah!" Their heads turn from side to side, attempting to see what could have caused this unheard of occurrence. None of them can see Mpi. He is invisible. In doing this, Mda shows us the simultaneous hypervisibility and invisibility that black people continue to experience to this day. Everyone can see Mpi, but in their thinking, there is no way that he could have solicited this response from Akon. Mda also marries the idea of the agency of black people and the duality of hypervisibility and invisibility through a former American slave who is very successful in his constructed Wild Zulu act. This man is extreme in his performance of so-called Zulu savagery. He kills a chicken, pretends to accidentally spray some audience members with the blood, and eats the chicken raw while locked in a cage. We later find out that the relationship between this man and his white master is a lot more complicated than it first appears to be. Mda's novel also teaches us the important archival work we have to do today for people who will look back on our present moment 50 or even 500 years from now. We must do the deliberate work of what Bibi Bakari Yusuf calls creating the archive of the future in the present. This was demonstrated to me when I told a close friend of mine about the novel. My friend asked me how it was possible that Mpi was not a slave at the time of the setting of the novel. She was astonished at the kind of life that Mda presents in the book. What this made me realize is that the dominant view of black people as just the oppressed and nothing else in particular periods in history is so prevalent that when we hear of alternative stories or ways of being that oppressed people always find, it becomes difficult for us to imagine. This friend of mine is a black woman who is a talented software developer and works for one of the major banks in South Africa. I asked her, how will someone in the future know that someone like her existed? Where would this person start to look for her? A narrative like hers is not a dominant one, and it has the potential to completely be forgotten and lost to future generations. Once I understood this, I began to understand how someone can hear Mpi's story and question if a life like his was possible. With the Zulus of New York, Mda not only humanizes our collective ancestors, but he also affirms our existence in the present moment by locating us in the past. Hello everyone, thank you very much for watching. After the publication of the Zulus of New York, Zakes Mda announced that this would be his final novel. But fans of his books will be happy to know that he announced at last year's Abantu Book Festival that he's currently working on another novel. After the organizers of the festival had a cake made to celebrate what we all thought would be his final book for adults, he told those of us in the audience that the story did not want to let him go. Mda said that the novel will focus on the popular musical groups in Lesotho that are also involved in gang wars and illicit gold mining. This promises to be an exciting novel. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.